Please, don't take my little girl. The gavel came down before Amber Lawson could finish the sentence. 7-year-old Lily grabbed her mother's hand so tightly her tiny fingers turned white. Mommy, are they really taking me? And just like that, Judge Paul Clayton believed he'd ended another custody case. What he didn't know was that he'd just reopened a crime he'd buried 22 years earlier. Nobody in that courtroom noticed the elderly man sitting 3 rows behind Amber. He didn't argue. He didn't react. He simply watched Judge Paul Clayton the way a man watches someone he buried in his mind long ago. He'd spent 22 years learning how to sit perfectly still while something inside him went to war. Paul Clayton never looked at him. That would become the biggest mistake of his life. Because the stranger watching him wasn't Amber's lawyer. He wasn't family. He wasn't even there for her. He was there because of a secret. A secret Paul Clayton believed had died decades ago. Before this story is over, one forgotten secret will destroy a judge. One billionaire will finally keep a promise he made beside his sister's grave. And one little girl will unknowingly become the key to exposing everything. But first, you need to meet the man sitting in the 3rd row. If you enjoy stories where justice refuses to stay buried, take a second to subscribe. Now let's begin. James Gardner didn't look like a billionaire. That was exactly the point. Faded navy polo shirt, plain gray slacks, comfortable brown shoes that had walked more courthouse hallways than corporate boardrooms. No expensive watch. No jewelry. No bodyguard standing nearby. Nothing that would make a bailiff glance twice. To the court clerk sorting paperwork at the front desk, he was just another citizen observing a public hearing. To the deputies standing beside the courtroom doors, he was invisible. Even Judge Paul Clayton, adjusting the sleeves of his black robe behind the bench, never gave him a second look. That was exactly how James wanted it. 2 miles away, inside a quiet parking garage on 5th Street, a black sedan sat with its engine idling. Behind the wheel, a man named Otis casually read the morning sports section. He wasn't worried about the time. He'd worked for James Gardner for 19 years. He understood that some mornings couldn't be measured by clocks. They had to be measured by justice. Because the quiet man in the faded polo shirt wasn't an ordinary observer. James Gardner was the founder of Gardner International, a logistics empire operating across 4 continents. His companies moved billions of dollars in goods every year. His foundation had quietly built children's hospitals, funded scholarships, and transformed struggling communities without ever asking for recognition. He hadn't given a television interview in more than 6 years. But none of that explained why he was sitting inside courtroom 4 of the county family courthouse on an ordinary Tuesday morning. He wasn't there because of Amber Lawson. He wasn't there because of Marcus Hale. He wasn't even there because of today's custody hearing. He was there because of a folder. Not Amber's. His own. A worn leather file that had remained open for 22 years. Inside were anonymous complaints, sealed adoption records, faded photographs, suspicious bank transfers, forgotten witness statements, and one name that refused to disappear no matter how many times James tried to leave the past behind. Paul Clayton. 3 complaints had landed on James's desk during the last 4 months. Different mothers, different children, different circumstances. The same judge. The same pattern. The parent with the expensive lawyer always won. The struggling parent somehow always lost. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses were ignored. Procedures applied to one side, but somehow never to the other. James had learned something decades earlier. Some courtrooms are watched by everyone, and understood by almost no one. Family court wasn't one of them. Family court was barely watched at all. No television cameras. No reporters. No jury. Just one judge. 2 families. One gavel. And a decision capable of changing a child's entire future in less than an hour. Most people trusted the system because they never saw what happened inside those rooms. James did. That's why he stopped sending investigators years ago. He came himself. Quietly. Unannounced. He sat in the back. He listened. He watched. He waited. Because justice has a habit of revealing itself to those patient enough to keep looking. He didn't yet know the young mother's name. He didn't know that in less than 15 minutes, everything he'd spent 22 years trying to prove would walk through those courtroom doors carrying a worn paper folder instead of a leather briefcase. The courtroom door opened. Amber Lawson stepped inside with her daughter's hand wrapped tightly around her own. Under one arm she carried a paper folder whose corners had softened from being opened night after night at a tiny kitchen table. Inside were school records, doctor's reports, letters from teachers, receipts, Every piece of evidence she'd spent weeks gathering because she believed the truth would matter. Her hair was pulled back the way exhausted mothers wear it when they're trying to look stronger than they feel. Beside her, 7-year-old Lily wore a yellow dress with matching ribbons tied carefully into her curls. It wasn't an expensive dress. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of dress a mother chooses because she wants the whole world to see that her daughter is loved. Across the aisle, the atmosphere changed. Marcus Hale walked in wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit that probably cost more than Amber earned in a month. He never looked at her. Not once. Instead, he leaned toward the attorney seated beside him and whispered something. The older lawyer smiled. Not because he was confident. Because he already believed he knew how the day would end. Another attorney placed a thick leather portfolio on the table. Every document was neatly tabbed. Every exhibit professionally prepared. Every page carefully organized. James looked at the thin paper folder resting in Amber's lap. Then he looked across the aisle at the expensive binders stacked neatly beside Marcus's legal team. He didn't need to read a single page. He already understood exactly what he was watching. This wasn't a custody hearing. It was an ambush dressed up as due process. James's fingers rested quietly on the leather notebook across his lap. To everyone else they looked perfectly still. But beneath that calm exterior, memories he'd spent 22 years trying to bury had begun clawing their way back to the surface. Because long before Paul Clayton became Your Honor, there had been another courtroom. Another frightened young mother. Another child taken away. And another promise made beside a fresh grave. A promise James Gardner had never stopped trying to keep. And without realizing it, Amber Lawson had just become part of that promise. Before the courtroom. Before Marcus. Before any of it, there was just a girl named Amber, growing up in a small brick house behind a chain-link fence, in a family that never had much but never let her feel the lack of it. Her father drove a delivery truck for 22 years without missing a shift. Her mother cleaned houses on weekends to fill in the gaps his paycheck couldn't cover. Amber grew up watching two people work themselves thin without ever once complaining in front of her, and she absorbed that lesson the way children absorb the things nobody has to say out loud. Love looks like showing up, even when you're exhausted. She was 12 when her father's heart gave out in a gas station parking lot. She remembered the funeral only in fragments, her mother's hand gripping hers too tightly, the smell of lilies, the strange quiet of a house that had always had his boots by the door. After that, Amber became the kind of kid teachers remembered fondly without quite knowing why. Not the loudest, not the smartest, just the one who noticed when someone was struggling and did something about it. She walked a younger neighbor to school every morning for 2 years after his mother lost her job. She sat with kids nobody else sat with at lunch. It wasn't performance. It was just who she was. She wanted to be a nurse. There was no money for that, so she trained as a home health aide instead, and later moved into hotel housekeeping, where the pay was slightly better and the work asked slightly less of her back, if not her heart. She met Daniel Lawson at 24 at a laundromat, of all places, both of them waiting on the same broken dryer. He was quiet in a way that made her feel steady rather than bored. He noticed things, the way she'd apologize for taking up space, the way she flinched at raised voices. He never tried to fix her. He just stayed. They married within the year. Amber's mother cried through the entire ceremony, the good kind of tears, and told Amber afterward that Daniel was the first man she'd ever trusted with her daughter's whole heart. Lily was born 2 years later, 7 pounds of impossible weight that rearranged something permanent in Amber's chest the moment the nurse placed her in her arms. Daniel cried. Amber didn't have words for what she felt, just a certainty, immediate and total, that she would spend the rest of her life protecting this one small person. For a while everything was small and good. Daniel worked as an accountant for a local nonprofit. Amber kept her hotel shifts. Their apartment was modest. A leaky window Amber never got around to fixing, a second-hand couch that dipped in the middle, but it was warm and it was theirs. Then on a wet October night, Daniel didn't come home. A car accident on the interstate. Gone before the ambulance arrived. Amber remembered very little of the year that followed, only that she survived it by picking up double shifts, because grief doesn't pay rent and Lily still needed shoes that fit. She remembered Lily asking for months when Daddy was coming back and not having an answer that didn't break something in both of them. She rebuilt their life in small pieces. Pancakes on Sunday mornings, the one meal she never rushed. A bedtime routine that never changed. 2 books, a glass of water, the hallway light left on 3 inches, because Lily said monsters couldn't fit through gaps that small. A stuffed rabbit named Pepper that had long since lost an ear and never once left Lily's arms at night. Lily wanted to be a marine biologist. Or a chef. Or, depending on the week, The lady who paints the lines on the road, because she thought the yellow was pretty. Amber never corrected her. She just listened and remembered and tucked every dream away like it mattered, because it did. It wasn't much of a life by some measures. But Lily was safe and Lily was loved, and until 3 weeks ago, Amber had believed with her whole chest that this was enough. Then Marcus Hale called. She barely remembered his voice, Daniel's older half-brother, a man who'd worn an expensive coat to the funeral, said all the right things and vanished for 6 years afterward. "I've been thinking about Lily," he said, each word sounding rehearsed. "About the life Daniel would have wanted for her. She deserves better than what you can give her, Amber. You know that." Amber laughed at first, certain she'd misheard him. She hadn't. 3 days later, an envelope arrived at her door, official and cold, stamped with the seal of the county family court. Petition for guardianship. Amber stood in her doorway reading her daughter's name typed beside Marcus Hale's, and felt the floor of her life quietly give way beneath her. If you asked most people in the county what they thought of Judge Paul Clayton, they'd tell you he was one of the good ones. He'd sat on the family court bench for 18 years. He gave the keynote every spring at the Children's Advocacy Gala, always the same line about how the law's highest calling is protecting those who cannot protect themselves, delivered with just enough emotion to make the room go quiet. He'd been photographed reading to kids at the county shelter. There was a plaque with his name on it outside the courthouse annex, funded by a grant he'd personally championed for foster youth. He was, by every visible measure, exactly what a family court judge should be. James Gardner had spent 22 years learning how little that measured. He kept a folder, an actual folder, not a file on some server, because some things James didn't trust to anything he couldn't hold in his own hands. It had started thin. Now it filled most of a drawer in his home office, a drawer he opened more nights than he liked to admit. Inside, photocopies of custody rulings going back 2 decades, the kind you had to request in person and wait 6 weeks for. Newspaper clippings about Clayton's charity work, laid beside case outcomes that told a very different story. A list, updated every time James found a name to add to it, of mothers. Always mothers he'd noticed, always the ones without money, who had walked into Clayton's courtroom confident in their case and walked out without their children. None of it, on its own, proved anything. Judges lost cases in every courtroom in the country. Custody law was messy, subjective, easy to defend as judicial discretion. James knew that better than anyone. He'd spent 6 years on the State Judicial Conduct Commission learning exactly how much cover that phrase provided. But James also knew something the Commission's official complaint forms couldn't capture: the feeling of watching it happen. The particular way Clayton's face went smooth and unreadable the moment a self-represented parent began speaking, like he'd already stopped listening before the sentence finished. The way his rulings, when you lined enough of them up side by side, always seemed to bend the same direction: toward money, toward polish, toward whoever had walked in with a leather binder instead of a paper folder. James had seen that particular tell only once before, a long time ago, in a courtroom 2 states away. He didn't like to think about it, and so of course he thought about it constantly. Another courtroom. Another young mother, exhausted and out of her depth, certain that telling the truth plainly would be enough. Another child taken. James hadn't been sitting in the back row that day. He'd been standing at the front, powerless in a way he had never allowed himself to be since, watching a decision get made that could never be unmade. He had promised himself, walking out of that courthouse, that he would never again be a man who simply watched. It had taken him 22 years to become a man capable of doing something about it. Every dollar of Gardner International, every hospital wing, every quiet act of philanthropy that made the papers, none of it had ever fully answered for the year he'd failed to act. He'd built an empire, and some nights it still felt like consolation. He hadn't expected to find Clayton's name again so directly. The commission complaints had led him here, to this courtroom, on the strength of pattern and probability, not certainty. He'd expected to watch, take notes, and leave with nothing more than a stronger hunch. Then he'd seen the paperwork on Marcus Hale's table. It was the binder that caught his eye first, thick, tabbed, the kind of documentation package that took real money to assemble. But it wasn't the wealth that stopped James's breath. It was the letterhead peeking out from beneath one of the tabs, half visible from 3 rows back, close enough that 2 decades of memory snapped into focus like a lens finding its subject. A foundation name. A very particular shade of formatting on the letterhead, the kind no 2 law firms would coincidentally share. James had seen that exact letterhead once before. In a courtroom 2 states away. 22 years ago. His pen, which had been resting idle against his notebook, went still in his hand. It wasn't proof. Not yet. A letterhead wasn't a conviction. But James Gardner had not built an empire, or spent 2 decades quietly investigating a man everyone else called a hero, by ignoring a coincidence that precise. Paul Clayton had not changed at all. He had simply gotten better at not getting caught. And this time, James was not going to be the man who only watched. Judge Clayton called the courtroom to order at 9:14 a.m., and by 9:17, Amber already understood how this was going to go. "Ms. Lawson," Clayton said before she'd finished her first sentence, "I'm going to need you to summarize. We have a full docket." Amber closed her mouth around the rest of what she'd meant to say, about Lily's pediatrician, about the report cards, about the 6 years she'd never once missed a parent-teacher conference. She started again, shorter this time, and made it 4 sentences further before he cut her off again. "I have the documents," Clayton said, not looking up. "You can submit them for the record." He said submit them for the record the way other people said throw them away. Amber had brought a letter from Lily's second-grade teacher, 3 paragraphs describing a child who was bright, secure, and clearly deeply loved. Clayton took it, glanced at it for perhaps 4 seconds and set it in a stack without comment. He did the same with the medical records, 6 years of well-child visits, every single one on time, not one flagged concern. "Noted," he said and moved on. When Marcus's attorney rose, something in the room's temperature changed. "Your Honor, this case is, at its heart, about stability." He said the word like he was laying down a winning card. "Mr. Hale can offer Lily a home in a top-rated school district, private health care, a college fund already in place. Ms. Lawson works double shifts as a hotel housekeeper. She has no savings, no retirement account, and by her own admission, occasionally relies on a neighbor for childcare when her schedule runs long." He said it so smoothly it almost didn't sound like an accusation. Almost. "We're not suggesting Ms. Lawson doesn't love her daughter," he continued, and Amber felt her stomach drop at the but she could hear coming from 3 words away. "But love alone does not raise a child's test scores. Love alone does not guarantee a stable home in 5 years or 10. Structure does. Resources do." Clayton nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he's already agreed with something before it was said. "That's a compelling framework, counselor," he said. "Thank you. Compelling framework." Amber had watched him take 3 seconds with Lily's medical file. He gave the attorney's sentence more warmth than that. When it was her turn again, Amber stood, and for a moment the courtroom blurred at the edges. She thought about the 8 books read every single night without fail. The bad hair day braids that got better with practice. The Sunday pancakes. The 3 inches of hallway light. "I don't have a college fund," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "I don't have a 5-year plan on paper. What I have is every single day of my daughter's life. I've never missed one. I'm not asking the court to reward me for that. I'm asking you to see it." Clayton's expression didn't move at all. "The court appreciates your testimony," he said in the exact tone he'd used to end a phone call he found tedious. "Given the financial documentation and character references submitted by petitioner's counsel, the court finds it in the best interest of the minor child to grant temporary guardianship to Marcus Hale, pending a full custody evaluation. Ms. Lawson will retain supervised visitation, scheduled to be determined." For 1 full second, nobody in the courtroom moved. Then Lily, who had been sitting very still in the front row beside a court officer, understood what the words meant before her mother's face fully broke, and she was across the small space between them before anyone could stop her, arms locked around Amber's waist. "Mommy, no, I want to stay with you." "I know, baby. I know." A bailiff moved toward them, gently, the way people move toward something they don't want to be the one to separate. The gavel came down. Amber held Lily as long as she was allowed to, which was not long enough, and somewhere behind her, 3 rows back, a man in a faded navy polo shirt closed a leather notebook without writing another word in it. James Gardner didn't need to write anything down. He'd seen enough. He stepped out into the hallway before the courtroom had even fully emptied, phone already in his hand, and dialed a number he'd saved under a single word, Naomi. She picked up on the second ring. "I found him," James said. There was a pause on the other end. "Same one from the Whitmore case?" "Worse," James said, watching through the frosted glass door as Amber Lawson was led, one hand still locked around her daughter's, toward the exit. He never stopped. James Gardner had told very few people about his sister. Not because he was ashamed of her, he had never in his life been prouder of anyone, but because the story had no ending he could live with, and he'd learned that most people needed stories to end somewhere. Rebecca was 5 years younger than James, born when their parents had already stopped expecting another child, and from the beginning she was the soft counterweight to everything James was not. Where he was careful, she was open. Where he calculated, she trusted. Their mother used to say Rebecca had been born without the part of the brain that expected to be disappointed, and for the first 26 years of her life, the world had mostly obliged her. She had a son at 24. His name was Michael. She raised him alone in a small apartment 2 towns over from James, working as a receptionist by day and taking in sewing work by night, and every photograph James had of that year showed the same thing. A woman who was tired in the way that only came from loving something completely. When Rebecca got sick, a bacterial infection that turned into something more serious, requiring 3 weeks in the hospital and a longer recovery after, she did the responsible thing. She arranged temporary foster placement for Michael through the county agency, signed every form they gave her, and trusted, the way she trusted most things, that the system existed to help people exactly like her. The attorney the agency assigned to process her case was a young man named Paul Clayton, for years out of law school, sharp-suited and soft-spoken, the kind of young professional who made overworked parents feel like they were finally being taken seriously. James had met him exactly once in a hallway outside a family services office, and had thought nothing of him at all. That was the detail that haunted James most all these years later, how ordinary Clayton had seemed. How easy it had been to trust him. What James didn't learn until much later, pieced together slowly over years through records requests and a retired clerk's fading memory, was that Clayton had falsified 2 documents during Rebecca's recovery. One recharacterized a routine welfare check as a concerning home environment assessment. The other listed a fabricated missed appointment that never happened. Together, they were enough to shift Michael's case from temporary to contested, and once it was contested, a judge who had never met Rebecca signed off on a permanent placement with a wealthy couple who had, records later showed, made a substantial donation to a children's charitable fund the same month the ruling was issued. Rebecca fought it for 11 months. She hired a lawyer with money she didn't have. She showed up to every hearing healthy, employed, and desperate, and every time, the paperwork Clayton had filed sat in the record like an immovable fact nobody bothered to question twice. She lost. Legally, finally, permanently. James remembered the day she called to tell him, her voice so flat and hollowed out that for a moment he thought she was reading him a stranger's news. Rebecca never fully recovered. She kept working. She kept getting up in the mornings. But something in her had been switched off and it never switched back on. She died 9 years later. Her heart, the doctor said, though James had never believed that was the whole explanation, still believing until the end that the law had simply gotten it wrong. She never knew it had been arranged. James had spent every year since trying to prove what she never got the chance to. He'd tracked Clayton's rise from junior attorney to family court judge, watched him build a public reputation as a champion of children with a kind of horror he could never fully explain to anyone who hadn't lived it. He'd found fragments, a clerk who remembered irregularities, but wouldn't go on record, a donation ledger that led to a dead-end shell account, a single witness who had vanished before James could reach her. He had never had enough. Not once in 22 years. Until this morning. Sitting in his car outside the courthouse, replaying the hearing in his mind, James understood with sudden, sick clarity exactly what he'd witnessed. A mother who trusted the system. A judge who dismissed her evidence without reading it. An opposing party with more money than love, and paperwork polished enough to make cruelty look like concern. It wasn't similar to what happened to Rebecca. Was the same. The exact same machinery, running 22 years later with a different mother's name typed into the blanks. James sat very still for a long moment, hands on the wheel, and made himself a second promise, quieter than the first one, made half a lifetime ago at his sister's grave, but no less absolute. Not this time. 3 days after Amber lost temporary custody, an unfamiliar number lit up her phone. Ms. Lawson? My name is Naomi Reed with the Fulton Family Justice Fund. We provide free representation in certain custody matters, and your case was referred to us. I'd like to take it on if you'll let me. Amber sat down hard at her kitchen table. I called legal aid weeks ago. They said 6 months. Legal aid isn't who sent this to me, Naomi said. But the offer's real. No cost to you. Amber said yes before she'd finished the sentence. She'd learned, over the past 3 weeks, not to look too closely at anything that finally seemed to be going her way. What she never learned was that 11 days earlier, a single anonymous donation had moved through a holding company 3 layers removed from Gardner International, earmarked specifically for the Lawson matter. Naomi hadn't found Amber on a waiting list. James Gardner had put her there, then made sure it looked like something else entirely. Naomi Reed was 38, precise, and had walked away from a corporate partnership track years earlier to do work that mattered more than it paid. She'd taken James's calls for 2 years now, funding grant after grant, and had long since stopped asking why a billionaire cared so much about family court reform. She did the work. He funded it. It worked. This case felt different from the first hour. He didn't just rule against her, Naomi told James that evening. The hearing transcript spread across her desk, highlighters bled dry. He dismissed her evidence without reading it. There's no reasoning in this ruling. It's not even trying to look reasoned. I know, James said. I was there. I want 10 years of his custody rulings. Pull them all. It took 11 days to see the shape of it. Laid side by side, Clayton's rulings over a decade were unremarkable in most cases. Reasonable, even generous. But in a specific subset, where one party's paperwork listed a particular foundation, Clayton ruled against the less wealthy parent 18 times out of 19. The foundation was called Bright Futures Children's Trust. On paper, a modest non-profit funding family transition services. Its filings led to a strip mall mailbox address and an executive director who didn't appear to exist anywhere else. It's a shell, Naomi told James over a dinner neither of them touched. Money moves in from wealthy petitioners as donations. Weeks later, a favorable ruling comes down. Every time. We can't prove intent yet, we need the money's other end and a witness. There was a witness, James said quietly. A long time ago. Different case. She disappeared before I got close. Disappeared how? I don't know. That's been the problem for 22 years. Naomi didn't push. Some doors even she hadn't been let through yet. While Naomi worked the financial trail, her team turned to Marcus. It didn't take long, he hadn't been careful. Buried in Daniel Lawson's estate filings was a trust in Lily's name, established 2 years before his death. Just over $340,000 releasing at 18 with one exception buried in the fine print. A change in legal guardianship could unlock early disbursement for the minor's care and education. There it is, Naomi said, staring at the screen at 11 at night. Marcus doesn't want a daughter. He wants that trust, and guardianship is the key. Does Amber know it exists? She's not listed as co-trustee. Just Daniel, and after him, whoever holds guardianship. Naomi shook her head. She has no idea this is why she's losing Lily. James sat with that a long moment, thinking of a mother with a manila folder, believing the truth would speak for itself. Keep building the financial case, he said. I'm going to find the witness. Her name had once been Evelyn Price, a court clerk from the courthouse 2 states away 22 years earlier, who'd processed the paperwork in Rebecca's case. A single line in an old investigator's report, 15 years stale, said she'd once mentioned something that didn't sit right about the adoption file. Then she'd resigned without notice and vanished from every record James's people had ever searched. He went back to it now with resources he hadn't had 15 years ago. A research firm Gardner International used for acquisitions, redirected for the first time toward something entirely personal. It took 6 days. Evelyn Price had remarried, taken her husband's name, and now ran a small bookkeeping business 4 hours away, in a town James had never thought to search. No social media. No public trail tying her old name to the new one, just a marriage license that had taken 2 days of manual archive work to find. James read the report twice before letting himself believe it. She was alive. He typed one line to Naomi before he could talk himself out of the hour. Found her. She's alive. The reply came back almost immediately. Does she know what she saw was worth this much? James looked at the address. A modest house, 4 hours and 22 years from where it had all started. She's about to find out, he wrote, and sat a long moment in the dark, a promise finally after 2 decades, close enough to touch. Naomi called Amber on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks into a fight Amber still didn't fully understand the shape of. I need to ask you something that might sound strange, Naomi said. Did Daniel ever mention where he worked before the nonprofit? Anything about a children's charity, or a foundation? Amber frowned, phone tucked against her shoulder while she folded Lily's laundry. He did some accounting work for a charity a few years before he died. Write something. I don't remember the full name, he didn't talk about work much. Why? There was a pause on the line, brief but noticeable. I'll explain more once I know more, Naomi said. Amber, this is important. Did Daniel ever seem worried in the months before the accident? Distracted? Anything unusual? Amber sat down slowly on the edge of Lily's bed. She hadn't thought about this in years, had almost trained herself not to, because dwelling on Daniel's last months had only ever led her somewhere she couldn't afford to stay. He was quieter, she said finally. Working late. I thought it was just stress. He kept saying he needed to get some things in order. I thought he meant our finances. She swallowed. A week before he died, he told me, if anything ever happened to him, I should never let Lily lose her music box. He said it like a joke, almost. Lily was 3. She barely remembers him. Does Lily still have it? Amber looked toward the dresser in Lily's room, where a small wooden music box sat exactly where it always had, beside a lamp shaped like a moon. It's right here. It's never played a single note. Actually, I always assumed it broke years ago and never got around to fixing it. Another pause, longer this time. Amber, I need you to open it. Carefully. Today if you can. Amber carried the box to the kitchen table, Lily trailing behind her, curious in the particular way 7-year-olds are curious about anything adults suddenly find interesting. That's Daddy's box, Lily said, climbing onto a chair to watch. He used to say it holds something that'll protect me and Mommy. I forgot that until right now. Amber's hands went still over the lid. He said that to you? Lily nodded, matter of fact, the way children deliver enormous information without understanding its weight. A long time ago. Before he went away. Amber opened the box. The mechanism inside was broken, just as she'd remembered, the little dancing figure inside frozen mid-turn, gears jammed with age. But beneath the velvet lining at the bottom, where a music box shouldn't have had anything at all, her fingers found a seam that didn't belong. A false bottom, cut and fitted so precisely it had survived 7 years of handling without ever coming loose. Inside, a flash drive wrapped twice in a small plastic bag, and a folded sheet of paper in Daniel's handwriting that made Amber's breath catch before she'd even finished the first line. If you're reading this, something happened to me, and I'm sorry I never found a way to tell you while I could. I found things at Bright Futures I shouldn't have found. I copied everything I could before I lost access. I don't know who's involved beyond the people I worked for, and I was afraid to find out. Keep this safe. If anyone ever comes for Lily, this is why. Amber read it 3 times before she could make herself move. She called Naomi with shaking hands, and within 2 hours, a courier James had arranged sat parked outside her apartment building, and the flash drive was on its way to a data forensics team Naomi's fund kept on retainer for exactly this kind of moment. What was on it exceeded even what James had hoped to find. Daniel had copied nearly 4 years of Bright Futures' internal financial records before his access was cut off, donation logs cross-referenced against custody case numbers, a running spreadsheet Daniel himself appeared to have built to track the pattern he'd noticed, and, most damning of all, a ledger detailing wire transfers from the foundation to 3 accounts, one of which, once traced, led directly to a numbered account controlled by Paul Clayton. Naomi called James at 11 that night, her voice tight with something between exhaustion and disbelief. He built the whole case for us, she said. 4 years ago. He saw it happening and he tried to stop it, and it cost him everything before he ever got the chance. James sat with the copied files open across 3 monitors in his study, reading Daniel Lawson's careful, methodical spreadsheet, the work of a frightened man trying to leave behind proof for a family he wouldn't live to protect himself. Send everything to the U.S. Attorney's office first thing tomorrow, James said. Certified copies. Don't wait on me for anything. And Clayton? James looked at the numbered account, the 6 years of donations, the pattern that finally had a name attached to every piece of it. For the first time in 22 years, James Gardiner smiled. Let him find out in a courtroom, he said. The same way he took everything from everyone else. The second hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday 9 weeks after the first, and Amber walked into courtroom 4 not as the woman who had stood there with a manila folder and no lawyer, but beside Naomi Reed, who carried 3 sealed banker's boxes and the particular calm of someone who already knew how the morning would end. Amber didn't recognize the man who walked in behind them at first. Gone was the faded navy polo. James Gardiner wore a charcoal suit tailored close enough to suggest he'd worn suits like it for decades and simply chosen, most days, not to. A silver tie. No notebook this time, nothing left to observe quietly from a distance. He walked to the row directly behind Amber and sat down without a word, and it was only when Judge Paul Clayton glanced up from his docket, in the same absent way he'd glanced at every case that morning, that Amber saw something happen to the man's face. Clayton's eyes found James and stopped. For a long moment the judge didn't move at all. Something crossed his expression that Amber couldn't name, not quite recognition, not quite fear, but the particular stillness of a man doing rapid arithmetic he badly did not want to be doing. Your Honor, Naomi said, rising before Clayton had fully composed himself, before we proceed, I'd like to enter new evidence into the record regarding the original custody determination in this matter, along with a formal motion requesting recusal. Recusal, Clayton repeated too flatly. Yes, Your Honor. Given what we're about to present, I don't think you'll disagree it's warranted. What followed took 11 minutes, and Amber would remember afterward that it felt like watching a wall come down in slow motion. Inevitable once it started, but somehow still shocking with every new piece that fell. Naomi laid it out in order. The financial ledger tracing 6 years of donations from Bright Futures Children's Trust into a numbered account. The account's connection, confirmed through banking subpoenas obtained the week prior, to Paul Clayton. Daniel Lawson's own handwritten notes, copied from the flash drive, cross-referencing 18 custody rulings against the timing of specific transfers. And finally, sworn testimony, submitted that morning, notarized and witnessed, from a woman named Evelyn Price, a former court clerk who had watched 22 years earlier, as a young attorney named Paul Clayton forged an unfitness declaration against a mother named Rebecca Gardiner in order to clear the way for a private, well-compensated adoption. At the name Rebecca Gardiner, James rose from his seat. He didn't ask permission. Nobody stopped him. 22 years ago, James said, his voice carrying without needing to be raised, you took my sister's son from her using a forged document in a different courthouse in a different state, and you told yourself it didn't matter because she was poor and alone and had no one who would fight for her. You were wrong. I've spent every year since making sure you were wrong. Clayton's hand, resting on the bench, had begun to tremble. This is an ambush, Clayton said, his voice cracking in a way it never had in 18 years on that bench. I want this evidence stricken. Federal investigators already have certified copies, Naomi said calmly. This isn't the only room this evidence exists in, Your Honor. Behind Amber, Marcus Hale had gone pale in a way she'd never seen. He leaned toward his attorney, whispering something urgent, and his attorney's face, in turn, drained of its earlier confidence entirely. I didn't know, Marcus said suddenly, loud enough to carry, standing halfway out of his seat. I swear to God, I didn't know about the girl's mother, Rebecca. I only knew about the trust. Clayton's associate told me guardianship would clear the way to access it. I never asked how he made it happen. I never wanted to know. Mr. Hale? His attorney hissed, but it was too late. The courtroom doors opened. 2 federal agents entered without hurry, badges already visible, and made their way down the center aisle with the unmistakable calm of people who had been waiting outside for exactly this moment. Clayton stood so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor behind him. For one absurd second, he looked toward the door behind the bench, the one that led to his private chambers, the one he'd used to disappear after difficult rulings for 18 years, and took a single step toward it. A third agent was already standing in front of it. Judge Clayton, the lead agent said, you're under arrest for judicial bribery, obstruction of justice, and falsification of court records. Please step down from the bench. Clayton's legs seemed to fail him for a moment. He gripped the edge of the bench, the same bench from which he'd dismissed a mother's medical records in 4 seconds and praised an attorney's cruelty as a compelling framework, and for the first time in the entire proceeding he said nothing at all. James Gardiner watched, silent and still, as they led Paul Clayton out of the courtroom in handcuffs. The same courtroom where 22 years in 2 states removed, a promise made at his sister's grave had finally been kept. The third hearing took place 2 weeks later in a different courtroom before a different judge, and Amber understood within the first 10 minutes that this time she was actually going to be heard. Judge Miriam Osei read through the full case file before the hearing began, visibly, deliberately taking her time with pages Clayton had dismissed in seconds. When she finally looked up, she looked at Amber the way no one in a courtroom had looked at her in 3 months. Ms. Lawson, she said, please take whatever time you need. Amber spoke for 11 minutes without a single interruption. She talked about bedtime routines and Sunday pancakes and the 3 inches of hallway light. She talked about double shifts and homework at the kitchen table and a stuffed rabbit named Pepper that had lost an ear and never once left Lily's arms. She didn't perform any of it. She simply told the truth plainly the way she always had, and for the first time the truth was allowed to land. Lily's teacher testified next, describing a child who was secure, articulate and clearly cherished. A court-appointed psychologist, this time actually qualified and actually thorough, testified that Lily showed every sign of a stable, loving home environment and notably significant anxiety around the prospect of separation from her mother. Then Lily herself, gently questioned in a side room with a child advocate present, said the only thing that mattered in the entire 9-week ordeal, relayed to the court afterward in careful official language. She wants to go home with her mom. Marcus, when finally called, didn't fight it. His attorney had withdrawn 2 days earlier. He sat alone at the table where a leather portfolio had once sat, and when Judge Osei asked if he had anything to add, he said only, "No, Your Honor. I was wrong. I should never have done this." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was, Amber thought, the truest thing he'd said in the entire case. Judge Osei didn't take long to decide. "Full custody is restored to Ms. Lawson, effective immediately," she said. "This court finds no credible basis for the original guardianship determination and further finds that the minor child's best interests were never served by these proceedings." Amber didn't fully register the words until Lily was already running down the aisle, past the gallery, arms already open before she reached her. "Mommy?" Amber went to her knees and caught her daughter completely, and for a long moment neither of them let go, and Amber cried the way she hadn't let herself cry in 9 weeks, not from grief this time, but from something that finally had room to release. James came to Amber's apartment 3 days later, on a Sunday evening, carrying nothing but the weight of what he'd never told her. He told her about Rebecca, all of it this time. The infant's son, the forged documents, the private adoption paid for through a shell charity, the 22 years of searching. He told her he hadn't come to that first hearing for her. He'd come for Clayton. "I didn't choose your case, Amber," he said. "I chose to sit in that room because I was hunting a man who ruined my sister's life. You just happened to be the mother standing in front of him that day. Everything after that, Naomi, the investigation, the witness, that was for you. But I want you to know the truth of how it started." Amber was quiet for a long moment, Lily's laughter drifting faintly from the next room where she was showing Pepper her new room's window view. "You're telling me this like you think it changes something," Amber finally said. "It doesn't. You didn't just save me, James." She looked at him steadily. "You saved every mother who'll never have to face him again." James didn't have an answer for that. He just nodded, and for the first time in 22 years, something in his chest finally fully let go. 1 year later, on a bright Saturday morning, Amber Lawson cut a ribbon outside a small storefront office 2 blocks from the courthouse where it had all begun. A hand-painted sign above the door read, "Lawson Family Justice Center. Free legal support for families in crisis." Naomi Reed ran the legal clinic 2 days a week, pro bono, exactly as she'd promised. A quiet, anonymous grant from a foundation with no public name funded the rest. Office space, a small staff, a fund to cover court costs for mothers who, like Amber once had, walked into hearings with nothing but a folder and the truth. Inside the lobby, beside the front desk, hung a single framed photograph. A young woman with a wide, open smile holding an infant boy. A small plaque beneath it read simply, "In memory of Rebecca," because someone should have believed her. Lily, now 8, spent that Saturday running between the folding chairs with a plate of cupcakes, delivering one to every guest by name, including the tall man in the faded navy polo shirt standing quietly near the back, watching the whole thing unfold with an expression Amber had never quite seen on him before. "Grandpa James," Lily said, handing him the last cupcake, "you have to try this one. It's the best kind." James Gardiner took the cupcake and for the first time in 22 years, he let himself simply belong to something good.